Good afternoon all and welcome to Cadarn Cymru revision sessions. This session this afternoon will focus on GCSE history and will be presented by Mr Penny from Stanwell School in Penarth. The session will last around 45 minutes and Mr Penny will go through the relevant subject content. If you have any questions or queries, please use the Q&A section and we'll endeavour to answer your question during the event. The session will be recorded with the recording and any relevant resources uploaded to the e-sgol website within the Cadarn Cymru section. Good, diolch yn fawr, thank you so much. Over to you, Mr Penny.
Hello everybody. The purpose of this first session is to help you discuss and explore three typical examination style questions. I will focus today on the USA paper, which is a Unit 2 paper, which I understand is a very popular unit across Wales. If you look at the first screen, I'm going to focus on questions 1, 2 and 3. And then in a later session, I will then discuss more from questions 4 and 5. So if I just start by looking at typical question 1s. Now, I do have a few questions in place, and we can see how many we get through in this short period of time. So number 1, use a source in your knowledge to describe something. A typical exam question. As you can see in this case, it's a photograph based on a speakeasy in 1925 during the era of Prohibition in the United States. The first thing I would point out is to look at the actual needs of the question. For example, a good candidate will discuss what they can see in the source, also what they can see in the bottom of the screen in what I would call the annotation, which says speakeasy in 1925, and whether they address their own knowledge in this answer. And look carefully, the impact of Prohibition. That's what the question is asking you. It's not asking you why it failed, not asking you why it came in, stroke introduced. It is asking you what the impact of it was on the United States. So I'm hoping you already have some alarm bells ringing with regards to what you can see in the source and what you can use from your own knowledge. So if we just walk into this question, for example, what I will pick out is what to not include. A silly answer, you might argue, is where the students start discussing, is it useful? Is it reliable? What is the purpose of the source? Is it biased? Is it exaggerating? What is the intended audience? Well, quite frankly, that's irrelevant for this question. It's asking you, what do you know from the source and from your own knowledge? So a few aspects we could discuss. For example, from the source, we can see a number of things. Now, I have written down here that I would not start with the word, the source tells me that. I would use language such as it demonstrates that, it highlights the fact that, it illustrates. So what have I picked out? From the source annotation, you remember that it shows it's a speakeasy in 1925. So I would say it highlights the popularity of these illegal bars, speakeasies, despite it being a period of prohibition, where, as you know, alcohol was banned following World War I, pretty much. It also highlights, you can see in the photograph, people laughing and drinking quite publicly with no real shame. They're even holding up the sign to show their disregard for the law here. It clearly illustrates people are openly drinking alcohol, despite it being against the law. It also illustrates that both genders participate in this post-prohibition alcohol culture. Not everybody, of course, but people from both genders were willing to take this risk and go against the law. So that is a few examples from the actual knowledge of the source, the content of the source, sorry, which might well score you, say, a maximum of 3 marks. Now, a pupil who's revised will be able to show the examiner the wealth of their knowledge by discussing other impacts of Prohibition. For example, you might say, in addition or furthermore. A number of points raised here. The rise in corruption caused by Prohibition. the actual failure to achieve its aims at this time. The main aim was to reduce or stop alcoholic drinking. Well, this actually rose, as we know. The actual fact that there's a higher number of drinking establishments as a result, in this case, illegal saloon bars, what we call speakeasies. A rise in the actual consumption of alcohol and a disrespect to the law. Many people thought it was a ridiculous and antiquated, old-fashioned idea, which didn't fit modern-day American culture. And of course, at the top of the page, I've highlighted the issue of gangster violence and gang-related crimes, like bootlegging and racketeering. Bootlegging, you remember, was the illegal smuggling of alcohol, mostly across the border from Mexico or Canada. Racketeering, protection money paid to gangsters such as Al Capone. So in essence, we would aim to have a good level of support from the source, as we included here, from the source itself, and the annotation, which is always underneath the source, and then a few aspects from our own knowledge to secure a higher score response, hopefully 4, 5, or 6 out of 6. What I will remind you of is the fact that before each question, they tell you which key issue we're discussing. So it would say this question is about the prohibition topic, which, as you know, is key question 3 for the USA module. So that's one example of a source and knowledge. If I can now show you a second one, use the source and your own knowledge to describe the treatment of minority groups during the 1920s. Again, we do not discuss who wrote the source. We do not discuss is it biased, what its intended audience is, etc. You just focus on content of the source and your own knowledge. Forward. There's a few clues already in the annotation, aren't there? It shows the KKK, an illegal terrorist group. It shows they are involved in the cities, Chicago in this case. And it shows that in the 1920s, they are of a high level of influence. So what can we see in the source? The source illustrates or highlights or discusses how popular the Klan are. You can see by the sheer number of participants in the Klan. You sense that it is an organised rally, which is well attended by patriotic and proud people who believe they are defending white supremacy, as seen in the uniform itself as well. The annotation implies the popularity of the KKK in the cities. You might add that many Black Americans moved northwards during the Great Migration of the 1920s or post-World War I. So that might account for the rise in the Klan in the northern cities. But in particular, as you know from your knowledge, the main rise was in the southern states, the Deep South, or in the Bible Belt states. We can also see from the source that the Klan are intimidating, they are anonymous as well, hence difficult to bring them to justice. You can see a Grand Kleagle there in the middle of the picture, as in showing a local leader of the KKK. And of course, you can see the American flag, implying that they are doing America's work to purify America. If you look carefully in the top right-hand corner, I believe that's an image of a burning cross, implying that the Klan are doing God's work. So that's a part of the source extracted. Now, what about knowledge? It's interesting, the question asked minority groups. So maybe you might be fooled into thinking you might just discuss Black Americans. Well, at the bottom of the page, I've given examples of Native Americans and the mistreatment of immigrants, especially new immigrants. For example, immigrants from Eastern Europe. But I've given you more examples at the top of the page of the mistreatment of races. For example, segregation, which formerly kept black and white people apart. Inferior resources are then given to the black Americans. Lack of funding, for example, to the black schools, black pupil schools. Segregation, examples in education, in leisure, in transport, beaches, armed forces. It's what we might call the Southern way of life, isn't it? The Southern way of life. We might discuss the treatment imposed by the KKK, like floggings, tar and feather, and the illegal hangings of a person by a white mob, which we call lynchings. There's also the economic aspects, often the first to be fired and last to be hired, unfortunately. So I think we have a good level of details there about black Americans, but also Native Americans and immigrants here. So if we go back to the question, it's not asking us to discuss the KKK, it's asking us to discuss minority groups as a whole. And we have discussed three certain groups already. If I just move on a little bit to another quick question for question 1. Using the source and your knowledge, describe the causes of the Great Depression. If I pause for a second, if you can all just look at the source very briefly, see what you can extract from the source before I continue in about 10 seconds. There's no need in the answer to discuss it's a newspaper, so it might be biased, or it's a newspaper, so it's a contemporary piece of evidence. That's irrelevant. We're discussing what we see and what we know. So what did we get from the source? It shows the trigger event, doesn't it? The trigger cause is indeed the Wall Street crash. We might use the chemical term, a catalyst, that speeds up the reaction of the Great Depression. The source implies that Black Thursday is a crucial date where there's a mighty drop, indeed a dramatic plunge in share prices, or a dramatic plummet in share prices. The media reporting the dramatic lowering of share prices. This implies the serious nature of the event, how catastrophic it was. It shows the level of hysteria and shock and anger, as seen in the crowds developing in Wall Street to try to ascertain whether they can actually recover their lost money. It also speaks at the top of the page about suicides, which allegedly was about well-known share investors who'd lost a dramatic amount of money and so took their lives. So plenty to see from the source alone in that case. But what about our knowledge? I've added a few here. It's about over speculation. It's about hysteria. It remarks about the panic selling of shares. Perhaps it's about the actual nature that many share buyers were amateurs, inexperienced investors who panicked too easily. But of course, we need to remember the Wall Street crash was not the only cause of the Great Depression. We might venture into discussing some of the more medium-term causes. Farmers' problems, for example, where they overstretched their finances, who had overproduced. Tariffs imposed by other nations in retaliation to the Republican-imposed tariffs of the 1920s. Under demand. Maybe consumers were not buying enough consumer goods because they bought their needs during the early 20s due to buying on credit or due to the heavy level of advertising. At the top, I've also mentioned certain industries struggling, like cotton and coal, and of course, farmers. So we should have a good level of understanding now of the use of the source and the actual use of contextual support to aid this. So we have covered already 3 examples of question 1. So now we need to move forward a little to question 2. Question 2 are the describe questions. So I've picked out 2 questions here, which are quite demanding. The first one is the red scare. Describe what is meant by the red scare. 8 marks. You may well be tempted to discuss perhaps 3 or 4 points in your answer. 3 or 4 points, well developed, should secure you a solid mark, worthy of a solid grade. So what is the actual red scare? I pick out a few points here. If you look at the photograph, you'll see 2 hints already. 2 people on the right are who we know as the Sacco and Vanzetti alleged criminals in the Sacco and Vanzetti case, who were both sent to electric chair, despite there being a considerable amount of evidence suggesting they were indeed innocent. The photograph on the left shows Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General at the time, when his house was bombed. This resulted in the arrest and deportation of many suspected Reds in the Palmer raids. So let's go back to the top of the page. What actually is it? They are examples of it, the Red Scare, but the Red Scare is the anti-communist viewpoints post-World War I. In particular, post-1917, the Russian Revolution, and obviously during the 1920s. There's a great mistrust of the Reds and their Marxist ideology. The ideas of Karl Marx, Marxism, communism. It was seen as an un-American ideology, which could have a potential and destructive impact on American prosperity and the sharing of prosperity, sharing of resources. Many feared their property could be at risk under communist rule. We know that the fear was rather exaggerated. One comment made was they were as dangerous as a flea on an elephant, as in rather insignificant compared to the wider population in America. So why did it happen? Experiences in Russia, like the fall of the Tsar and his wife and the family, the Russian Revolution itself, union activity on the rise in the United States in the 20s, or supposedly on the rise, fears of the level of possible threats to America. For example, threats to American homeland. There were a number of bombing attempts. For example, there was one in Wall Street in this era. And we've seen examples of this Red Scare, how it leads to a victimization of certain people. You might think about what it suggests about American society. Does it imply prejudice, discrimination? Does it imply a sense of hysteria and over-exaggeration of the threat? So again, we've discussed quite a lot of detail already, and my advice would be to try to discuss 3 or 4 themes in a few paragraphs, of course, to try to develop your answer sufficiently. Obviously, it would say at the top of the page, this is a question based on immigration and the Red Scare, which we know is from key question 1. Next one. The main social and cultural changes of the Jazz Age. And look at the question. It's not asking you, did everybody enjoy the Jazz Age? It's not asking you, why was it popular? It's not asking you, who did not like the Jazz Age? It's asking you to describe the main changes. One piece of advice would be to perhaps start with the topic you know the best. So if you know more about women's lives, you might start with that one, which I will do so now. Women's lives changing, the granting of the vote post-World War I, the daring and exciting lifestyle of the flappers, clothing, behaviour, etc. Strenuous sport, the growing confidence of many women at this time, or some women, growing fashion changes, car ownership, popularity of jazz, attendance at speakeasies, for example. There's plenty, isn't it, to show why women's lives, or to how much women's lives were changing. Top of the page, it's an exciting time of history, a period of history, sorry. Time of significant cultural changes, post-World War I, exciting years. Obviously, you'd need to discuss jazz music in its southern roots, seen as an exciting, vibrant, but also daring music, which was rather unique compared to pre-1920s music. It was a music that was embraced well in the speakeasies and in the concert halls. Music implied freedom. For example, daring behaviour. It helped extend the flapper lifestyle, the link to speakeasies, radio ownership, and of course, numerous examples of dances, but also musicians like Armstrong, Waller, and Goodman. Cinema, of course, was a major industry at this time. We have a move from silent movies to talkies at this time. The age of movie stars such as Charlie Chaplin, Clara Bow, role models within the cinema. People taught how to use cutlery and how to behave and how to be more daring because they were motivated by these major industry stars. The growth of the motion picture, like the jazz singer, the first. They imitated their behaviour, as I've mentioned earlier. And there were other changes, of course. Sport, like the wonderful boxer Jack Dempsey, the real glory of the wonderful baseball player Babe Ruth, Bobby Jones with golf, fads and crazes like the unique form of flagpole sitting, and the impact of radio ownership. So these are some of the main changes we could discuss, of course. So we've now looked at two question twos, both worth 8 marks. So obviously your level of detail and level of depth will dictate to you how well you will score for this challenging question. Clearly a question which deserves a great level of support and revision. So now we'd like to move our attentions to question 3. Question 3, the purpose questions. I'm going to pause for 30 seconds while you, the viewer, just looks carefully at what you think the purpose of this source truly is. Why is it made? What is the intention of the source? What is the rationale behind the source? What's the motive of the source? Why is it made? Clearly, there are many little hints in this source. First look at the source, you get a few ideas straight away. It's trying to show that it makes people poor. Trying to show that alcohol makes people commit crimes and they end up in the penitentiaries, which are prisons. It's a waste of resources, wasting grain. So you already have an image in your head. The purpose of this source is to show anger against alcohol, okay, and to show support for the prohibition drive. I would like to think you've already worked out in your minds that this post is before prohibition. Look at the date in the annotation, 1917. So during the World War I, and prohibition, the law, is still 3 years away. The annotation gives you an idea of why it was produced. The Ohio Dry campaign, dry as in moving away from alcohol. So what do we look at here? Look at the date as a start. So 1917, the purpose of the source. If we look at the date, that will avoid you making silly errors. Because sometimes students jump in and start talking about the dangers of prohibition and the negatives of it and the failures of prohibition. That's irrelevant, isn't it? It's asking you, why is this poster made? And clearly the date tells us it's before it became the law. It's not asking you about the problems caused by prohibition either. It's not asking you about the aftermath of the law. For example, Al Capone, speakeasies, that's irrelevant to this answer. So why is it being made? Sometimes pupils fill up half the answer because they go by traditional ideas they have. The reason why it's made is to stop alcohol. The reason why it's made is to get prohibition passed. They might struggle to get a sufficient amount of detail to get a high scoring answer. So it's a few little hints here what you could include. Purpose, why it's made, or what are the reasons behind it? What's the motive? The origin of the source, who made it, when was it made, why was it made? What's the background of the artist? What type of source is it? The nature of it. What's the tone of the source? Is it overly dramatic? Is it overly positive, overly negative? Is it exaggerating, for example? Who's it aimed at? Cheap is the one that I'm always keen to use. Justify, educate, entertain, persuade. In terms of cheap, for most sources, you probably find 2 of those 4 fit in well with this source, with most sources. The content, perhaps, you discuss, of course, and some of your own knowledge. Half of your mark will be given for your use of source evaluation. Half will be given for your use of supportive knowledge from your minds. So let's move forward then. What's the purpose of this source? Why is it made? I picked up a number of things here. It's made to show support for a ban of alcohol, to raise the profile of the Ohio Dry campaign, so to get publicity for banning alcohol, to promote the campaign, to create an anti-alcohol feeling, the guilt of it. So people who do drink at home in 1917 might feel that it might damage their livelihood and their life and their family lives. One of the bottles is angrily saying, "We rob women and children." So alcohol takes finance away from a family, which clearly need it. The dangers of alcohol are mentioned here, aren't they? Talks about poverty, links to Germany, World War I. Look at the second barrel and the use of the banner. It implies the German links. Many brewers at the time were German origin. Resources were wasted. Look at the "We waste grain" banner towards the back. So these are the purposes of the source, to try and show all this. So what we're doing is we're using the source, we're expanding on what we can see. It's trying to show support for the campaign for prohibition. What about the tone of the source? Dark clouds ahead, isn't it? It's a miserable atmosphere in this source. It's a very angry, confrontational style here to clearly show their distaste for alcohol. It's trying to be highly critical, trying to be persuasive, and try to induce guilt on our behalves or on the behalf of the readers. Trying to justify, think of Jeep, trying to justify the growing support for the dry campaign. So people will then be attracted to the idea. To educate people on the horrors or the dangers of alcohol, that's a clear method used here. Who are the audience? Residents of Ohio, parents perhaps, because of the comment, "We rob women and children." Trying to impress against people who do like a drink, trying to influence them to becoming anti-alcohol. Maybe it's trying to influence senators who will be voting in Congress with regards to this possible constitutional law, which was then granted in 1920, as you know. It's also trying to show that it's a popular idea. If you look at the left side of the picture, you can see a crowd of people, vaguely a crowd of people, implying that people are getting angry. And the dark clouds are rising, aren't they, in the background? That there are tough times ahead if we do not accept prohibition. There's plenty there from the source alone. Obviously, in the answer, in the exam, you might spend, say, 10 to 15 minutes on this question, probably 10 to 12 minutes, I would have thought. But what could we have brought in from our knowledge? I've discussed lots from the source, but what else is there from our own knowledge? in terms of the knowledge, we could have talked about the actual problems to do with the war. We could have talked about the health issues with regards to prohibition. Alcohol was seen as harmful, causing issues with stomach problems, heart problems, liver and kidney problems. Alcohol was seen as ruining family lives. Alcohol was regarded as being a danger to productivity. Henry Ford, for example, was critical of alcohol. He thought it damaged productivity at this time. There's plenty we can consider from the source itself. As you can see, I've picked up and expanded on much of that, but then also we've added in a few factual details to support this. I hope that was helpful to you. Right, the next purpose question. I picked this from topic 6, the entertainment topic. What is the purpose of this source? We just spend 30 seconds having a quick glimpse of the source. Do things come to mind already? The source is illustrating to us that they are trying to show the benefits of the jazz music, that it's a very welcoming culture. Both genders are involved in the jazz age. It's a very popular pastime with musicians and singers. It shows it's a very positive time to live in America. Bit of 1926, as in a good time to be American, good time to live in the northern states in particular. And what else is the purpose, of course? Maybe to sell magazines. It's the front cover of Life magazine, 1926. So, we see. We think again of the main elements, what we might consider to look at for this question. Why is it made? What type of source is it? How is the source produced, as in the tone? Who is it aimed at, audience-wise? Can we mention Jeep at all? There's quite a lot to consider, isn't there? So why not let's discuss the source first of all. Maybe it is trying to generate interest in jazz music. Maybe it's trying to raise the profile of musicians like Armstrong and Goodman. Maybe it's trying to create interest in the music industries to, of course, raise profit levels, raise revenues of this vastly growing product. Maybe the purpose is to stress the positive nature of jazz, trying to show the enjoyment and the positivity of jazz music. The fact that the crowd are enjoying the music and they're all together. It's very combining atmosphere, as you can see. Maybe the purpose is to show it's very positive, trying to show an exciting tone in there. Perhaps it's trying to show a very persuasive tone for American people. A very dramatic sense comes through this source. Of course, it's trying to persuade people to support Hollywood and jazz music. And of course, to part with their hard-earned wages and their wealth. Whether that's parting with their music to pay to go to jazz clubs or pay for a radio or buy the flapper kind of clothing shirt, as seen the central image of the source. Maybe it's to part with their money to buy a new the Life magazine shirt, maybe. Perhaps it's to educate the people about the new style of music and its impact on culture. Let's think of the audience. Maybe it's trying to influence possible female readers in particular. Maybe it's showing the flapper culture. Maybe it's directing at males because the musicians are males in here. Maybe it's trying to influence future supporters of jazz, but also the flapper culture. Their own knowledge, we could add on a few extra pieces here, couldn't we? Maybe it's there to raise profits during the boom period, the 1920s, economic prosperity. Possibly it's to highlight and to showcase the jazz age itself, a period of great social change, of great excitement. Maybe it's trying to persuade people of the glories of jazz music and musicians. Perhaps the middle two are the main causes of this source. Make a profit for the magazine, to raise revenues for the magazine producers. Promote, to advertise, to encourage viewers, to encourage a greater readership of this growing magazine at this time. Maybe it's to show pride in being American in 1926. Possibly it's trying to win over doubters who think the jazz age is far too decadent and far too daring and rebellious. There are a number of possible concepts behind this source. Maybe it's to advertise the growing glory of musicians like Louis Armstrong. So we've used a lot of information there from the source and the textual knowledge. There is no way you'd remember all of these, but you might hope to have 2/3 of a side of notes, or maybe a side of notes, as long as you discuss why you think it's made, using the source, using these great little hints, but then also using your own contextual support. In terms of marks, there are 4 marks available for the use of the source and 4 marks available for the use of your contextual support. So I'm now going to finish with one more question, a similar question about the entertainment topic, but maybe slightly more focus on Hollywood. So have a quick look yourselves. Maybe you can spot a number of reasons in this source to show us why it's been made. There's a number of clues here. Perhaps the purpose is to show it's a major triumph. Maybe the purpose is to signpost, showcase Warner Brothers. Maybe it's trying to show the attraction of the main film, The Jazz Singer. Perhaps the intention is to show that genders come together due to jazz and Hollywood. Perhaps the intention is to show different generations would love jazz music. And look at the annotation. It's a movie poster for The Jazz Singer, 1927. There's probably 2 or 3 clues already why it's made. Perhaps it's to sell the movie, it's to promote, to encourage people to part with money to see the film. Maybe it's there to showcase jazz as a social movement. Let's think of our context, our knowledge here, why it's made. Maybe it's there to raise profits during the boom period. Maybe it's to show the evolution of filmmaking, in particular, the talkie aspect of films. Perhaps it's there to make a profit and to raise financial revenues. This major juggernaut of an industry will grow and grow and grow in the 1920s. Perhaps the intention is to promote motion pictures, which are starting to grow in the 1920s. Maybe it's there to show the star system, that these stars are of crucial importance. Perhaps the big clue is the fact that Al Johnson's written in major red letters to highlight the importance of the star. Perhaps advertising is used heavily here to encourage support and enthusiasm and an adoration for the movie industry and the star system, which I've already mentioned, individuals like Clara Bow. So we've already discussed the knowledge for this source, but then of course we discussed quite a lot earlier on in terms of why it's produced. You know, the positive source, the positive nature of the source itself. The audience, is it aimed at jazz enthusiasts? Is it aimed at elder generations to show it's an embracing culture? Is it aimed at younger individuals? trying to influence a great support for jazz music in future. So I would like to think that that was of good use to you. And the next session I produce on source work, I'll focus more on source questions, on how useful. So that's it for me. Thank you.